All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth class of our five-session online seminar, Getting Started in Family History Research. My name is Kathleen McKenzie, Education and Programming Manager here at American Ancestors, and I will be moderating tonight's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. Returning for this fourth class tonight is senior genealogist Melanie McComb. Melanie holds a BS from the State University of New York at Oswego. She is an international lecturer who teaches on a variety of topics, including colonial through 20th century American military research, genetic genealogy, Atlantic Canadian, African American, Jewish, and Irish genealogy. She is also an honorary fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. She has had articles published in American Ancestors magazine and 50 Plus Advocate. She is also a blogger known as the Shamrock Genealogist. So in this fourth class tonight, Melanie will delve into the research process. She will discuss several online search strategies, tips for researching at repositories, and other best practices for gathering information. As usual, we will have 3 breaks for questions during tonight's class, so at any time, please go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A field found at the bottom of your screen. You'll find a PDF of today's slides at the online course page, as well as a handout. And starting tomorrow, you will be able to go back and watch a recording of tonight's presentation on that course page. All right, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Melanie.
Thank you, Kathleen, and good evening. At long last, through this course, we are now at one of the most fun parts of genealogy, and that is actually doing the research. So in class 1, we identified what you already know, and you conducted some interviews with family and going through inherited research. With classes 2 and 3, you worked with David on defining specific research goals and questions, and you made that source shopping list. And during this class, we're actually going to go through that shopping list and conduct the research and go and try to answer some of those questions and objectives on the research log. And then next week, Rhonda's actually going to go through the analysis process and is going to take a few examples from tonight and go through them further and also add some more examples of her own as well. So let's begin. Let's start with some general principles of research. So a couple key tips that we'd like to recommend is since it is not usually a one and done process where you will just find one document to answer a particular question, especially if it's a little bit more complex, such as identifying the parents of an ancestor or maybe their origins in another country. In that case, it's helpful to really look at multiple sources to identify that question to make sure you have the correct answer for what that should be. We're going to emphasize that you track your work in your research log. So you're going to constantly show us, you're constantly going to see slides showing us update the log with our findings from this research. And when possible, and while I may not have time to show every original document, it's always helpful to make sure that you're looking for where an original document is existing, because that's going to help to make sure that you are always looking for where the original source of where that information comes from. So we want to make sure that we're always looking to see when there is something that does survive that you can see that record. And also, it's helpful to actually understand the records because you want to make sure you understand what is the record actually accounting for and what is the record actually documenting in this time. Because there could be a lot of reasons why a record was created, and genealogy is not that focus. So it's helpful to understand what that main purpose of that record was, so you understand what the record is telling you and also what it's not telling you. The genealogical proof standard that we introduced in class 1 goes over the research process. And the biggest principle that comes out of the genealogical proof standard is you need to conduct reasonably exhaustive research. You can't visit every archive that ever existed in every location where your ancestors lived and look at every book, manuscript, other collections. You will simply run out of time. There is a small amount of even manuscript collections that are even available online as well. So that's why we have to also prioritize the sources that are going to give us the most bang for our buck, so to speak, and to try to answer these questions. So really going to more go-to sources and consulting what we can to determine that. But sometimes you just can't look at every single item possible. Let's talk about some online search strategies. Because a lot of your research is probably going to take place online, as it's going to make it more accessible. You can do this right at home, and at 3 a.m. and your fluffy, slippers and everything, from the comfort of home, especially in this winter, for anybody, especially in the Northeast and other places where it's very cold. So, some tips for when you're doing online research is you want to make sure that when we go and do a database search, is that sometimes you don't rush right into conducting the search the first time you go on a site like Ancestry or Family Search or even American Ancestors. You want to maybe understand what the databases that you are searching are covering, the individual places, time periods, and the completeness of the records. You want to use the site's catalog if you have one. A lot of them are going to have some version of a card catalog, similarly like what we used to use back in the day, the Google of the time. And you'll see that a lot of that has been made available through an online catalog where you can easily see what contents they have. And then you also want to consult your any kind of wikis that are available. You also want to look at different search terms as an art. It is not, it can be a science, but it's also an art. You have to kind of understand how you can use search terms to maximize what you are searching. So you want to think about these different portions of your search terms. First, location, location, location. It's helpful to know where exactly we are searching for a particular type of record. Then you want to drill into more of the type of event. So are we looking at a vital event like a birth, a marriage, or a death? Or maybe even a time period like if there was military service, such as like a military conflict going on, or some other event that might have been happening during that time that would have created a lot of records. And then you also want to look at the overall time period. So whether it's the overall like the 17th century or even down to specific decades as well. Secondly, is when you start to think about, okay, now I want to place my person by name into the search. Now, depending on the different sites, um, for example, if you were trying to search like a newspaper site, I like to use quotation marks to make sure I'm searching for someone's name exactly as I had typed it, first and last name. So if I had searched my name, Melanie McComb, if I put it in quotation marks, it's only searching for where that is an exact phrase versus places where there's a Melanie McComb, Melanie, and any name with just McComb, and that could pick up Macomb County, Michigan. And that makes it harder to kind of filter through. So sometimes we have to look at places of where we can make the name more of an exact search. We then can go down into different types of records, such as occupation. So thinking about like if you are looking for someone that was a soldier, a baker, any other type of occupation that would define who they are, a farmer, as a way to kind of make sure that you're looking for someone particular. This is really helpful when you have someone with a more unique occupation. I was actually helping a friend recently, and we noticed that in one level of the family, all these brothers were all stone cutters, and they all worked in the local stone quarries near where they lived. There also is a way of using what we call one-word modifiers. So while it's not like an occupation, but maybe we know that someone is the quote, the younger or the junior member of that community. Sometimes there is a nickname that someone might have been given, and that can be a way to kind of differentiate if you have the right person. And when you start seeing things like middle names coming up, especially into, like late 18th century and late 19th century and later, you can find that sometimes that middle name also could be another way to modify your search to know that you're looking for the right John Smith because maybe, well, he's John Albert Smith, not John Michael Smith. When you're searching a database, less is more, which means you don't want to search on everything that's available and put in every single piece of information, including their name, their birth date, their birthplace, their death date, their and marriage, etc. Depending on the database, they are going to want you to use a small amount of information as possible to maximize your search. So I generally will start with names, maybe years, depending on what the database is searching for, and then I will filter down my location after I get my first set of search results. You also want to look at the records that are what we call before and after your target, which means sometimes there are records that were indexed, but the page before or after may not have been included in that database search, or maybe they include neighbors or family members that are going to be important to look before and afterward. So, for example, if you found someone in the census, it's good to look before and after the first couple of pages because you might identify other members of the extended family living right near them. Or maybe you found a passenger manifest and you found that right on the previous page was members of the family accompanying maybe children coming over. So it's always good to just make sure that you're not isolated to just that one page, but maybe look around it because maybe there's something that just didn't quite come up, but the context helps. And as I emphasize, you want to make sure when possible you seek out the originals. Transcriptions can be pretty good depending on what types of records they are, but you are relying on someone to read the handwriting and the context of a record. So errors could come up. There could be things that are not transcribed. I had a really interesting case where I was looking at some vital records for someone in colonial New England, and I noticed that the original, it gave like an extra like tidbit on them around, I believe it was around their death, and they added like some fact about their health in there or something that was not noted right away. So it might have been like a marginal note or something that was added in by the clerk, but it wasn't added in the transcription. So sometimes that can happen. You also may find that when records are what we call indexed, which means that we're making these records searchable, we want to understand that sometimes when they create an index page for a database, they don't include every fact and field from the record itself. They may give you a lot of pertinent information like names and age and location and maybe a relation to someone else on the page, but they don't include every single piece of information. And sometimes there might be something on there that was not indexed that may be crucial to know if it's your person. And then, of course, while we try to find as many records accessible as possible online for free and elsewhere, there are a number of things that you do need to go through subscription sites or pay repositories or other agencies to get access to records. So if you don't immediately find it online through some of the free sites or through Google, keeping in mind that may identifying different subscription paywall sites that exist is helpful. We also want to look at the idea of using wildcards. So with wildcards, this is a way of how you can search for someone using different ways of placeholders when you're doing a search. For example, if you use the question mark, this stands in for one character versus if you use the asterisk or the star, this is one or more characters. So if I wanted to search, for example, my maiden name, I may want to look at for which is Doherty. I may look at different spellings that could come up. It could be Doherty, like I have it here, Doherty. I've seen it as Dougherty. I've seen it as Docherty, Dochherty. So you may want to use perhaps an asterisk to stand in for more than one character. So if I wanted to look for, a UGH in there, for example, or one character with, Dougherty, or maybe it's a completely like the Docherty, a fully one, and I even can add in multiple stars even there too. So maybe if I know it's going to be in two different places, I could do that as well. So a lot of sites will support the ability to use these wildcards. Okay. So we so this is actually the research log that David had put together last week, and we are actually going to go through and show you how to research each of these different facts. So if you remember from last week, we were looking into finding the vital records and other primary records for Henry Poor and his family of Massachusetts. And we were looking at various online repositories. So we're going to go through the different source information, which is basically the different databases online, and we're going to go through a few different sites. So we're going to go through American Ancestors, Family Search, Ancestry, and briefly on Findgrave. And we're going to go through each of these objectives. Okay, so let's start off with American Ancestors. So with American Ancestors, best place to start with is going on to when you're on the main page, you want to go to the top part of the toolbar on the left-hand side where it says search. Under search, you have a few options you can get to. If you're trying to get to a specific database and see what actually exists and what types of things we have, we generally recommend people start with the A to Z list of all databases. So this is really our quote online catalog of databases. So that's really where you can see what do we have if you were going shopping. And so we get an alphabetical list of all the different databases, and you will see that they will account for different locations. So while we started off as the New England Searching Law Society and we have a lot of New England databases, we also have databases for other states and other countries that you will find here. So a couple things to note on this list is if there is a magnifying glass in that first bar on the left, that means you can actually search the database, which means it's not just browsable. So you can do a search within just that one database, put in a name or a location, and pull something up. The next icon is either a camera or a piece of paper. If there is a camera, that means that there is actually an image of that record. If there is a piece of paper, it means that it is a text-only database and that the original may have to be consulted somewhere else, like on Family Search. So in some cases, we actually are sharing databases with Family Search, so we may not have the rights to publish those images in some cases. We also have within the names, you might notice that there is a 10 in front of some of those, like Alabama, deaths and marriages. These are databases that have been classified as 10 million names databases. So this is part of our project to document and restore the names of the 10 million enslaved African Americans and even Native Americans that have come up in the United States. So when there's certain databases where we know there's going to be likely a lot of information in them, might tag them as 10 million names. You can do a search by database name at that top toolbar. That's a really helpful way to kind of get to something specific. So if you were to search by a name of a state or like vital records or a certain name of a journal, that's a good way to do a search so you don't have to go through the list. We also have a number of filter options. So you'll notice that we have about approximately 505 databases, and that is growing. You can actually sort these by your most recent ones that have been added, or just keep the A to Z sort. If you want to look at ones that are available free, so anybody where you don't have to be a paid member, you can look at those. Any ones that have the images, like I mentioned, with the camera. If there's any other exclusive database that you don't have access to elsewhere, especially if you are a member of like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for example, you do get somewhat of a membership with us, but you don't see everything we have. And you also can even favorite databases. So if there's ones you know you use over and over again, you can actually just filter that. You also can filter by location, and it's not seen here, but you can even filter down into different time periods as well and categories. Okay, so we have a few different objectives that we have for databases related to American ancestors. So there were four objectives related to finding birth, death, and marriage records in the Massachusetts Vital Records database. So there's actually one for 1620 to 1850 and one for 1841 to 1910. We then have a database for Suffolk County Index of Probate Records to search for some kind of will or other probate record. So that's going to be our objectives for American ancestors in this first part. Okay. So now that we're on the A to Z list, what we may want to do is go up to search by database name. Now, for those first few ones we're going to look at, they involve vital records for Massachusetts. So in this case, I search by database name of Massachusetts Vital, and this pulls up anything that has been tagged where it's in the title or description. So in this case, I've have 284 databases that have been classified, and I notice that the ones I really need are at the very top. So the one we're going to go and start with is 1620 to 1850. And again, we'll notice that there is a magnifying glass, which means we can search that one. So we are going to then click on the database and go into the search screen. Once you're in the search screen, you have options of how to search. So we can start with putting in the name here as well. Obviously, since we did a little shopping and identified that this database exists, it's going to include vital records 1620, 1850. So I'm going to put in Henry Poor. Now, since I have a lot of vital records I'm going to look for, I'm not going to put in a year or a record type or any other or a location at this point yet. So I'm going to start off with just a very basic search with the idea being less is more. And you'll notice that we have over 46,000 records that come up. Now, the way the search results come up is that they're going to prioritize the ones that are the most relevant up at the very top, and then the ones that are the least relevant are going to be more towards the bottom. So we're going to want to pay close attention to the records that come up and see if any of them match what we're looking for. Now, while I didn't add a year range or location, I do see that one of my first results was actually, it looks like a good record for his birth. There was a Henry Poor that was born in 1769 on June 20th, the son of Jonathan and Sarah. Now, while it does give you this preview information from the record index, we always want to make sure we go into the related image as well too, to see what else is there. So once we go into, first we're going to click into the record, it's first two. This actually gets you to the what we call the record page. So if we click into that, that actually will, again, give you that preview, and it tells us this is from the Newberry Volume 1 of this database, page 425. And then we're going to click View to get into the actual image then. And so here we see that there is a list of births for Newberry. This is a typed transcriptions of vital records that were taken as part of a project. And we're going to blow this up a little bit more. And here we see that there is Henry, as we scroll down, the son of Jonathan and Sarah, June 20th, 1769. Now, if we had identified any other siblings we were researching that were born to this couple, we may find that by looking at the Newberry births records here, if there were any other Poors that were also born around this time that we could pick up as well. So that's why it's also helpful to go into the record, because maybe there are others you might account for. So now we want to do is we want to update our research log with the information that we found. And we're going to note that we found a birth on June 20th, 1769 in Newbury, Massachusetts to Jonathan and Sarah. Okay. Now, one of the other databases we had was involving his death, which was later. And with that one, we needed to go into the Massachusetts Vital Records 1841 to 1910. Because if we were looking for a birth after 1850, it's not going to show up in that database that we were in. So we couldn't rerun our search. In this case, we do need to go back to our catalog and get the appropriate year range to do that search. So once we're in that database, we're going to put in Henry Poor. Now, in this case, we're only looking for a death record. So in this case, I'm going to just put in Henry Poor, and under the record type dropdown, I am going to select death. So we're going to narrow down because we're not looking for multiple records at this point. And I'm also going to even add in a location of Boston, Massachusetts, because we had that from the published genealogy. And again, we're seeing a lot of results that are coming up in our search results. However, towards the very top, we do see there was a death of a Henry Poor in 1853 in Boston. So we want to go to the page to look at that record now. So here is the record page. So it is, and I'm going to show you the image in a moment so you can see what it looks like, but it is basically a register style of deaths, which means all different deaths that were occurring in that same year, in that same town in Boston at that time. This tells us the volume and page it comes from, and also notes that it was not an amended record. Sometimes there could be a case where a record needs to be amended because there was a change that was made and maybe inaccurate information was given at the time. So always good to pay attention to if there was an amendment made and noted on this page. So here I see there was Henry IV, and I see that he had died at the age of 84 years old. It notes that he had died in Boston, and that his occupation was a carpenter. His place of birth was in Newbury. His parents' names were not listed, so if we did not find a birth record, we would not have that information, but always good to look at death records because that could be a place of finding parents' names based on surviving family that might have given that information, and sometimes from the informant if they went into like a hospital or other facility. It noted that the cause of death was noted as old age. So now we're going to note that the date of death, because he had died on April 28th, 1853 in Boston, Massachusetts, and we listed that we had found the death register, and that is now added into our research log. Okay. Now, another thing we want to do is when we do a search on database, we may want to combine some different options. So in this case, I'm going to search on, because now I'm looking for marriages. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to search in that 1620, 1850 vital records. I'm going to search on Henry Poor. But in this case, I'm actually not searching in just that one database. I'm actually searching all databases. So this is actually what we call like the advanced search screen. So we're not searching just one collection, we're searching all collections on the website. So in this case, I'm going to put in his name, Henry Poor. I'm going to add in his birth and his death years here. Now I'm actually adding a starting point of 1790. That's not his birth year, but that's about the age approximately where he would have been maybe legally able to get married, put him about 21 years old. So we want to put it in a range where he's likely to have been married to narrow down what years that could be. I have selected a record type of marriage, and for location, we're going to keep it as Massachusetts. So we're at least narrowing down, while even though I'm searching all databases, that based on his life, he hasn't left the state of Massachusetts. And so by doing combinations of these different records, we have a very low amount of records that actually are coming up. In this case, we only have 34 records. Now, something I didn't talk about before was we also have these search filters on the left-hand side. If you know that there is a very specific location, record event, or sometimes, the spelling of a name, although spelling doesn't count, you can move those little search filters from the left to the right, and that can narrow your search results. So we can make it basically going from broad to exact, and it lets you basically say, okay, I want this exact, phrase or term and only have these options versus just saying it would be nice to have it, but we don't want to filter it out. So I scroll down my list and eventually I find a record that corresponds with one of the wives on our research log. We find one for Henry Poor, who had married in 1792 in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and it notes that Henry had married an Abigail Johnson Hughes on August 23rd, 1792. So we go into the image for that record. And here we noted that are included with records of other people that were getting married in Newburyport. It also notes with an asterisk at the bottom that the intention was also recorded. So before we really had marriage licenses, you would have a marriage intention that would be filed in the town, and then you would have usually the reading of the banns that would occur in the local church or the town square to announce the marriage, and to make sure that it was going to proceed and there was not going to be any legal impediments to that. So in some cases, you might find that when there's a marriage intention, sometimes there could be a little more detail on it or slightly different variations of the name. So it's always good to kind of look into those things. And of course, if someone just has a marriage intention, well, that doesn't mean they got married. Sometimes that might be the only record we find in place of a marriage, but there are cases where marriage intentions were filed and the couple doesn't get married. So the other record we were going to look for is probate. So I'm going to go back to my A to Z list of databases, and I wanted to go into, since he died in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, it's very likely that he probably might have lived there. So we actually are going into the Suffolk County, Massachusetts probate records. Now we want to look at the index. So this is actually going to be an index of the different probate cases that were being brought to file. They're going to include people settling estates. They also could include things like guardianships, adoptions, and other types of records as well. But if we were going to look if someone had a will or other probate file, we'd want to check the index to see if there was one. And this range includes where Henry would be included if he had a probate. So we go to our search screen for the Suffolk County, Massachusetts Index of Probate Records, 1636 to 1893. We find Henry Poor, and in this case, I'm just going to start off very simply by just searching by name. So I do a search, and even amongst the 2,200 results, there really was only two records for different Henry Poors. However, the years don't match up. The first one is for a Henry Poor with probate in 1892, so that's quite a number of decades off. And then we have a Henry W. Poor that there was a guardianship. So, and we don't know if that was the case of where he was the guardian or the one having a guardianship set up for him. But again, it's still taking place still another decade later. And we didn't have any idea of a possible middle initial coming up, so we'd be a little suspect if we never saw any evidence of that. So, what do we do when we have record not found? We always want to make sure we record that in our research log. So even if you don't find that record, you want to make sure you're adding that. So I'm adding no probate found in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. Now, earlier, I also had some of the marriages where I would have noted here. So in this case, I added the marriage for Abigail Johnson Hughes, and I'd also found Martha Harrington as well, and noted those here too. So, but always good to make sure you're including your findings, whether positive or negative, in your log, because this will help to know that you've already searched something and don't have to remember if you've done it 6 months from now, years from now, have I already done it? And now we're going to turn to our first round of questions to talk about some of those initial search strategies and also searching on American ancestors. We're going to cover some of the other sites later, so I would say when we get to our questions, let's try to focus more on what we've already covered first. So let's turn to our first round of questions, Kathleen.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Melanie, for that great start to tonight's class. It's great to be delving into the research after kind of all the prep. So I'm just going to give everyone a moment. We don't have any questions at the moment, but I find a lot of the times we will get them in after a few seconds here. So I'll just give everyone a moment. But otherwise, we can keep moving things along. I know we've got a lot to get through tonight, and we'll have two more question sessions as well. But let's see here. Up. Yep, there's always some that come in. So we just got a question in, Melanie. Somebody asks, is the search where you can use the wildcards?
Yes, so you can use wildcards if you're specifically asking about like on American ancestors. When you're going onto the search screen, you can use wildcards. It is supported, and that's a good question. That when you're doing these kind of searches on different sites, it's always good to kind of note if there's anything in the descriptions that say they support wildcards. Most sites usually do. There are a couple exceptions I do see in cases, but most sites are going to let you do a wild card, so it's always good to give it a shot and see if what results do come up though. But yes, you generally want to go into either an advanced search or a database search, and that's where you could do that wild card search.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Melanie. And then somebody asks, can wildcards work on newspapers as well?
Yes, yes, they can. Now, again, it does depend on the different sites. I have used a few newspaper sites where they weren't quite accepting wildcards, but a lot of the sites I have used different options on. So I have done them on like sites like newspapers.com and others, so you can do it. Now, one thing I have seen happen though is sometimes when you use wildcards is you can't always use wildcards and quotation marks in the same search box. Sometimes it doesn't like that. So you might have to maybe use like wildcard in place of maybe putting in quotation marks on a particular name or or do vice versa. So just keep that in mind that when you do a search, you may have to narrow down what is possible. There might be other sites that don't let you do it. So again, it's going to really depend on the individual site, but most newspaper sites do allow some kind of wildcard search.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And somebody also asked, can you just reiterate the definition of a wild card? And I'm going to see if I can actually pull up the slide as
Yeah, let's
well,
do
because
that. That
that's
might be easier.
helpful.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
the idea of a wild card is just it's a way to search getting around spelling and variations of names. So it's just a way of how we can basically use the computer to find a record even if it doesn't read it the same way. And newspapers are a really good example because a lot of times, like newspapers, they are computerized, digitized using computers. And sometimes when they put a name actually out into their database, it may not be what was actually printed on the newspaper. So it tries and it gets it pretty close, but some letters don't come up the same way. For example, like the letter C, sometimes the letter C and O sometimes can get interchanged. And I find that sometimes like an O might get read as a C, where sometimes it doesn't see the rest of the loop of the circle, especially. Or if you have an O and an E, sometimes that can get mixed up. And there's other letters too. But basically, it's just a way of using a symbol to just replace or represent one or more characters in your search. So you're using a question mark for one character and the asterisk or the star for more than one character. So this is also really helpful, I find, especially when you're searching like names like in Eastern Europe, for example, or in Passage or Manifest, where the computers sometimes get the names totally wrong. But by using wildcard, you might have a way of narrowing down, like, okay, I can at least see maybe the first and the end of the name, and the middle is just what's getting scrambled. So this is what can help with that scrambling. So I hope that helps clarify a little better.
Thank you, Melanie. And somebody also asks, so if the search of a name on newspapers.com comes up with nothing, do you start with just choosing one letter, like a vowel?
Mhm.
And if that shows nothing, then do multiple before moving on.
Exactly. I would do, yeah, I would try the wild cards. I also would try, especially if you're searching for women, you may have to search like as Mrs. So and so if she's married, for example. So thinking about in a lot of newspapers, like women weren't listed with their first names ever in some records, in some cases. So it's always good to kind of try different variations of like how would someone have been referred in a record, and also think about like taking a name that may be a little more difficult for someone and sound it out loud, and think about how many variations you could come up with writing down. That's really what you're using wildcard is to do, is you're trying to fill in all those variations. So then you can kind of pick and choose the placement of those wildcards to kind of see if maybe you get a different result.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Melanie. So I think we will leave questions there for now. Let me get back up, back in the slides where we were. We did get a couple of questions that I wrote into the two askers. I'm going to save them for our final question session. For now, I'm just going to stick to questions about kind of each slide section, and then we'll do any other questions at the end. So
Great.
we will be getting to all questions that come in. But for now, Melanie, I'll go ahead and turn things back over to you.
Okay, great. So we're going to move on to another website, which I'm sure many of you probably have heard of or maybe used, and this is Family Search. Family Search is a free website. It is hosted by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You do not need to be a member of the church to use the site. Genealogy is a very big part of their religion, but they're also bringing records accessible to genealogists like us that want to find more information about our family. So, on Family Search, one of the big ones that we have on our log is looking for if Henry Poor owns any land in Boston, Massachusetts. So in this case, we're going to look at Suffolk County deeds to see if he had any land. Because we know that he died in Boston, so there is a good chance that if maybe he had lived there for some time, maybe he owned some property. And you might remember he was listed as a carpenter in his death record. So there's a good chance that maybe he had the financial means to buy some land and, maybe even built his own house. So when you're on Family Search, and by the way, I should note though that as of last weekend, it just went through an update. So there actually is a new homepage that you see here. This homepage lets you look at things that you might have recently viewed. So if you viewed other people within the Family Search global tree they have, or if you viewed record hints on people that are in your family tree, you may see some of those frequently used things on the very first homepage. So we're going to primarily focus on using the online catalog for Family Search. So what's good about this catalog is this lets you find records that have been, in many cases, put on microfilm or in some cases microfiche, and a lot of these have already been made available digitally. So you don't have to go all the way to Salt Lake City to view the microfilm in person. You can actually find a lot of these records are going to be available from home or at your nearest maybe affiliate library or center to be able to do a lot of this research. So the catalog is a very good tool to find records. Now, going back to some of our search tips that we had earlier, the best way to kind of use the catalog is to go and search by location. So remember, location, location, location. And you could be searching at a town or a county level, and then you might be then going into like state or country records, for example. So again, you want to think about maybe the lowest level someone might have lived in that records were created at to find those records. And you'll notice that things like deeds, for example, are going to be usually at the counties or in some states in New England, especially at town levels. So when you're on FamilySearch.org, you want to go up to the top toolbar under Search. You then want to go, and when you click on that, go into the drop down and go to Catalog. Now, the catalog just went through an update this past week, so if you've used it previously, you might notice a small difference here. When you're in here, I generally like to keep it defaulted to Search by Place. That's where it's going to start. And in this case, since I am looking for Suffolk County deeds, I'm going to look for Suffolk, Massachusetts. Now you'll notice there might be several entries in the dropdown that account for different time periods. And this is because the records that are created may be at a different level. If I was looking at records, for example, 1776 and earlier, I'm getting more Massachusetts Bay Colony records versus when we already were a country in 1776 on, it's going to show up under United States. So keep that in mind is that they've tried to build in time periods in there. So it's helpful to make sure you're looking at the right time period for the right location, knowing that there could be changes like county, like boundaries being renamed, counties being changed, etc. So once I've selected Suffolk, Massachusetts in the United States in the dropdown, then I'm going to go ahead and click search. From this list, you are going to get many different categories of records. From the results, I see that there is a category for land and property. So you have to think about how the records are organized by the type of records, whether they're court records, property records, probate, and then you drill into them. So I'm going to then expand on the arrow next to land and property on the far right to expand that category to see what's in that bucket. And from here, I'm going to see all types of records. I may see records of deeds that were published by other people that transcribed the original records, or maybe they abstracted them. But I really want to look for the most official sounding authors or agencies or courts that would have done these records. So in this example, if I'm looking for Suffolk County, Massachusetts deeds, I want to look at the agency responsible for actually maintaining the deeds. In this case, that would be the Registry of Deeds for Suffolk County. So we go into the collection that sounds like the most official, and we see that it counts for a wide range, 1639 to 1885, and it has indexes all the way out to 1920. So even if you can't get to the originals of a record, you may find there could be indexes that do account for later records that you know a record exists. So now that I found here's the records of deeds, indexes, deeds, etc. I see here's the author again, the Suffolk County Register of Deeds. It notes that these records were originally on microfilm. They were on over 1,128 microfilm reels. They were filmed by the Genealogical Society of Utah, and this was done all the way in 1969. So microfilm has been around for a long time, and you might notice that a lot of records have been done for a long period. It notes what the collection is part of, so it says the notes that these are including indexes to grantors. So you may need to do like a little dictionary search to look up terms. So a grantor is a seller, in this case of property, and or you're a grantee or you're a buyer of property. And it also includes indexes for persons other than grantors and grantees. So sometimes you may find they are individual companies or schools or churches that may have their own index sometimes too, in that case. So, and it notes here that where the original records are held. So in this case, they are held, the originals are in the Registry of Deeds in Boston, Massachusetts. And I think this is always very helpful to read these notes because sometimes I might find that the image is not available or hard to read, and you might have to reach out to that original repository to find out if you can get a better copy, for example. And it's also just good just to know who keeps those types of records and maybe you find other things. When you scroll down the list, you will then see film digital notes. So this is going to list each of the individual rolls of microfilm that have been made available. And generally, you're going to have indexes at the very beginning. In this case, they are doing indexes by grantor, so by seller, and then it is giving you a range alphabetically, and this is by their last name. So you have A to BY, CA to DY, etc. It is giving you different volumes within it, so there could be multiple volumes that range of surnames are coming across, and also a year range. So we have the 1639 to 1799 at the very beginning, and then it moves on to 1800 to 1899. So you need to pay attention to, in this case, what type of record you're looking for. Are you looking for someone selling or buying? What is their surname range? And what is the year range? So as I scroll down the list, I'm looking for records that are going to be, we're going to start off with like the 1800s. Thinking about by the time he's in Boston, we know he died by 1853, he's born in 769. 1800, it sounds like a good starting point. And we go into the index for grantors, and we're looking at, since we're finding poor, we're going to look into the poem to pren index here. So this is including volumes 202 to 204 for 1800 to 1899 years. You'll notice on the right-hand side, there is a camera icon. If there is a camera icon and there is no little alert, there's like a little triangle like that makes it look like there's a restriction or something like that, then you know if it's just like a camera like this, you can view these freely at home and you have full access. Sometimes there might be a little alert that locks it off, which means you have to go to a local affiliate library or center. But for now, these records are online, so we're going to go into the image and see the records. From here, you'll see that there is it's pulled out of the microfilm images that have been done. So you'll see different microfilm numbers. Then you'll see title slides, and then you'll see the beginning of the volume, and then you'll start to see the actual images. So it's always good to kind of pull all the way out because we want to make sure we're going into the correct index. So once we've located the right index and we found where poor surname is showing up, we then can start to look at different records. So, and here we start to see evidence of, here is a Henry, and different year ranges that are noted here. So it is going to list the year, the date, which is either the date of the transaction or the date it's recorded, the name, who they're actually selling it to, the volume and page number where you can find the records. And in this case, they even give a description of the property. So they might note the name of a street, the number of acreage, a lot number, some other notes that would be good to understand where that is. And especially when you look at cities, for example, you may start to see, ward numbers eventually, or in this case, they've even noted like mortgages as well. So once I've located a deed I'm interested in, I then want to go to the respective volume to find the record. So in this case, I actually have found something that's going to be in this volume set between 610 to 612 in the year 1850. And I then want to click on the camera icon to find the original record. Then once you're in here, again, you want to back out here. You want to make sure you're going to be in the right volume that is based on that index. And I'm eventually going to go ahead and locate, and once you get to the right one, you'll start to see where it's beginning and ending. So pay attention to those different title slide changes to make sure you're in the right one. In this case, there was a record I found in volume 611. So once I'm in 611, I know I'm in the right range of years of the images. I then want to then go and look for that page number. And you'll see that I'm doing, and I know it's hard to see here, is I'm updating that image number at the top left. So I'm really just kind of like jumping around with numbers versus going one by one by one. And once I've located the right page number, in this case it was page 300, I then want to scroll down and see where there is a mention of Henry Poor. And here I see that there is a mention. Now, while it's not obvious from the right-hand side margins, there actually is a mention there that Henry Poor of Boston in the county of Suffolk is actually named in this land deed. So this actually was a deed where it showed that um, Erastus Rugg of Chelsea, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and he was actually a deputy sheriff. So there might have been like a sheriff sale that was taking place. And we see that this was actually due to a judgment brought in court that was happening. And this was, and it mentioned about when this judgment had occurred in 1850, and it named the different parties that were here. and it was for the sum of $101.96 of damage and costs of suit that was taxed out, which the said Henry Poor had for that property. And basically, you would then continue on to the next page to read a little bit more. So sometimes it's not always obvious that someone is named in a file based on the marginal names, so it's always good to read the text as well. And so it basically just continues on, that at the time that it was noted here that it was a certain piece or parcel of land with a dwelling house that was situated in Boston, the county of Suffolk, and was described as follows. And then they describe the land and some of the neighbors, etc., of where this portion of property was taking place. So, and I basically summarized that land deed here. So I noted here that Henry Poor of Boston, and it noted that he actually had land on Church Street that was sold to him. And it continued on, it actually said that it was sold to him by a Charles H. Harrington. And in some cases, you get really lucky because they list what the original transaction had taken place. They would give you the volume or Liber, 578 folio or page number 206, and I could then locate the original if I wanted to see how he got that property. So if I wanted to do that, we can go back to our list now, go to deeds 578, 579. This is for the year 1847, so that gets us about 6 years before Henry had died. I want to go to the camera icon, and then I'm going to make sure I'm backed out into the right volumes, back all the way out, find the correct volume, knowing that there could be multiple volumes. In this case, it's in the very beginning volume, so I know I'm in the first half of these microfilm images. And from here, then I find page 206. So you can see 207's on the other page. And when I scroll down is then when I actually see the original deed that was mentioned there. So here I see that Mr. Charles Harrington of East Cambridge in Middlesex County, Massachusetts, had sold to Henry Poor of Boston, and you'll notice he had an occupation of housewright, which is like, again, a carpenter. So that's what I mean by those occupational terms are really good to look for because that helps you know if you have the right person. And so it notes here about the land and how he acquired it, and even, who might have previously lived on that land as well. So it's always good when when you find a record like this to think about if there's any clues that help you go to another earlier record of when maybe a transaction or something else had taken place to follow that trail. Now, Family Search has a lot of unique features that you can use. So in addition to wildcard searches, you can use alternative names. So if someone had like an alias or some other name they went by, if there was, like a record that might have noted maybe their original biological name or an adopted name, you can search by a relationship in your search. So if someone's spouse, parents, etc. You can search by multiple collections. There is a way to do like an advanced search by multiple collections for a lot of things, but keep in mind that not everything shows up in that search. So a lot of things that we saw, like the deeds, are going to be browsable. So if you don't find something in a search, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just might not be easily indexed for you to find it. You may have to go hunt for it a little bit in the website. There's also a really cool feature that you can actually take the results and export them to Excel. So let's say you're working through a lot of different entries. Sometimes it might be helpful to download, like here are all of the Henry Poors of an area and try to maybe rule out if they're a different person, like, especially if you find a lot of them in the census or other records. And then, of course, AI has definitely been a feature that's been incorporated into Family Search as well. And there is what's called full text search. So now try to find browsable records like deeds and court records and other types of records that may have been hard to find. It's now more easily accessible. So I've actually added some links, including an online video tutorial in your handout, which actually shows you how to use that full text search. Because we're not going to have time in tonight's class, but I wanted to make mention that there are ways to do searches for some of these difficult to find records using some of this new technology. And now let's get ready for our next round of questions, and let's talk about family search.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Melanie. So yes, any questions, do pop them into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. Melanie, we did get one more that came in just after we wrapped up the last question session. So it's
Sure.
another, so it says, other than wildcard searches, are there any tips for searching ship manifests when your ancestor has a very common name?
Yes, so if someone has a really common name, so one tip I have is like if you know that someone came over in a family group, sometimes it's easier to search for one of the children within the group because you might find that there are a smaller amount of, let's say, 10-year-old children with that first name where that could help you narrow down possibilities. Because then what you could do is you could do a search by, let's say you're finding a Mikkel and you're trying to find like a 9-year-old or something like that. Finding a Mikkel 9-year-old arriving at a certain port at a certain time, even better if you have a ship, could narrow down possibilities. I always like to say look for the most unique name of a family if you find it. Now, if someone is not coming over with a family, then if you know they have a certain occupation, that also could be helpful because sometimes those are indexed as well. So if they're not just simply a laborer or domestic that came over and they have something more unique, you may be able to narrow down like, well, oh, how many carpenters came over or coopers, people that made barrels or other things, or dressmakers. That might be a little more unique as another way to search too. There also are really good sites through, like if you're finding someone, I mean, through like New York, like the Ellis Island site. They have more specialized search pages. And there's also the site stevemorse.org, which is another great site to find some of those immigrant manifests, which uses wildcards and Soundex and other tools to find records as well. Soundex is another big one. So, because again, spelling doesn't count, sound does, you can find different variations of names of how they might have sounded, and depending on the different ethnicity, there are certain sound X's that are a lot more broader. Like especially when you're trying to look, for example, like for Jewish names, there actually are different versions of sound X that you can use that just makes it a more of a what we call a fuzzier search. So those might be the kind of things I would try to look into.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then we have a question here. Someone asks, is it not possible to search by land buyer, in parentheses, grantee, instead of only by seller, the grantor?
Yep. So in this case, we were just starting with a sale for the brevity of time. But yes, you absolutely can use those indexes for grantee as well. Now, I will say sometimes it's easier to search by grantor first because if they are married at the time of the land sale, it is possible that is something that has been becoming part of that marital property where they have to get their wife's permission to sell it and actually provide what we call a dower release. So in some cases, if you have a very common name, it can be helpful to know that you found them and them listed with their wife's name. You'll at least get her first name in there. And then you can narrow down, okay, I at least know they had property. Now let me trace backwards to see if I could find it. Versus sometimes when you try to search on someone just originally buying it and it's a very common name, it may be hard to tell if you have the right property. So that's why I like to backtrack it because you might know that that property was passed down in the family for years and went on to the children. You can identify the children getting it. And that's why sometimes going through the grantor index just might be a little bit easier.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then somebody asks, what is the difference between Family Search and Family Search Wiki?
Okay, so Family Search is the overall site, and a feature of the site is Family Search Wiki. So it is basically Wikipedia for genealogists that the Family Search staff, and there's even volunteers that help manage it as well. So the wiki can help you identify resources that are databases or books or other collections that could be used, but they also could be a little more broad. For example, we actually have a really good friend that works at Family Search that likes to work on and update websites related to military records. So he may use military records like here's all the resources on World War One. And it's not only just stuff on Family Search. It could be stuff on Ancestry. It could be stuff on the National Archives, where you have to order records from. It's basically giving you like a nice place to like do shopping of different types of, because it helps you understand context of what types of records exist, where to find them, how to use them, and have them in one place versus now, okay, Family Search, now you're going to use it as a tool to actually go out and try to find records, or if you wanted to find if other people had added on to the global tree and added information and facts on them as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then we have a question here from someone who asks, can you use a wild card for a date? For example, 184 instead of, for example, 1847 or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So you can use wildcards on dates. So, for example, if you knew that someone had maybe was born around 1850 and you weren't sure if it was 1850, 1852, 1858, what you might do is you might do like 185 and then add an asterisk, for example, to do that. And the reason why is that for on Family Search, the asterisk is the only wildcard I think they use. I don't think they use the question mark. So, but yes, you can do date-based wildcards on some sites. But I would say you want to be very careful that you're narrowing it down maybe by a decade. If you make it too broad, you're going to get a lot of results and a lot of it you might be filtering out.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Melanie. All right. Well, I think that wraps up questions for now. We will answer all other questions that come in the final question session tonight. But for now, Melanie, I'll pass things back over to you.
Great. Okay, so let's move on to now Ancestry.com, and then we'll do a little bit on Find a Grave, which has been put into the Ancestry.com umbrella as well. Okay, so Ancestry.com has different tools on how you can do searches. So again, it can also use wildcards. You can also search on a database type or what they call categories. So if you were looking for a category of a military record or a different vital record event or other things, there are different categories you can filter down on. They give you the option of those sliders to help make them more exact searches as needed, and they have their own card catalog as well. So on Ancestry.com and on Find a Grave, these are the three objectives we have. We wanted to identify Henry Poor in the U.S. Census between 1790 and 1850. We also want to see if he has a gravestone, and if I'm sorry, we have four items here, and if he has any military service in the War of 1812, and if we can find him in any city directory in the towns of Newburyport or Boston. So this is one way of getting to categories is when you go up to the search, instead of going to all collections, you can filter down on these other categories. So you can use census and voter lists. You have vital records, birth, marriage, and death, military, immigration and travel, and then you have the card catalog to search, do more of a list to see everything that's there. So in the case of a census, we're going to start off with census and voter lists. So we're going to start with Henry Poor. And we are going to give his year of birth as a way to narrow down because knowing that we are looking at records in 1850, there is going to still be a birth year on that record. So we're going to add in some information just to narrow down our search of what we already know. So we're going to put down Henry Poor, 1769, and born in Newbury, Massachusetts, and looking for any event without a year range in Boston, Massachusetts. And when you're in this search, so I have over almost 300 results. If I am interested in a very specific decade, so again, kind of like that wildcard search, like you're looking for someone in the 1850s, I could go to the 1850s and narrow down how many show up in that decade. So from here, now I have 189 results, and you could do additional filtering on the left-hand side under specific collections. So if you knew you were only looking at, let's say, a non-population schedule. So for example, if someone is farming, for example, that's a good place to look at those kind of records. Or if you knew there were certain states, you could do that too. Now, up at the top of my results, I do have one that looked pretty promising. There was an H. Poor, born in Massachusetts, who was living in the city of Boston in Ward 11. Now, we want to go into that record page to find out more information. So we see his birth year, 1770, Massachusetts. We see his occupation as a carpenter. So we're pretty consistent with what we're finding so far, so that's very good. He's in the construction industry and he has $3,000 in real estate, but we want to make sure we're going into the page just to see if we can corroborate some more information. So it might be a little hard to see, but you have Henry Poor, so you have H. Poor, carpenter. He's then listed with a younger woman here who's listed as Martha. And then he seems to have some other individuals that are in the household as well. So always good to look and see who else is in the household, even if we don't know the relationships, to narrow down those possibilities. I then might want to go into another year range. If we find him that looks pretty good for 1850, let's try 1840s. So again, we want to go back to that filters on the left-hand side, click on 1840s to see the results. And from there, I start to then see, okay, more examples of different ones here. Now here's another example of an H poor that is in Ward 10 of Boston in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. Now, obviously, I would try to look at maybe the one in 1840 as well. And now these earlier census records, we'd have to look at the age ranges to see if they make sense. So we know when Henry died, he was in his 80s in 1853. So this one does look pretty promising. It shows an age poor. There is a male in the household that is 70 to 79 years old. And then there is a female that's 50 to 59, and then there's otherwise some younger individuals that may be portions of children or grandchildren in there as well. And we also notice that he is engaged in some manufacture and trade. So that's another one where you can see some of that skilled work may have been noted. So someone that was like a carpenter, for example, would have been noted in that category. So while we didn't go into the images, we still want to note those records of what we found. So we did find evidence of him in 1840 and 1850 living in Boston. So now we're going to move on to the next question. But as a tip, we want to make sure we always look into is that card catalog, because similar to Family Search and American Ancestry has their own card catalog of records that you can find things. How you access the card catalog is you go up to the search, you go to card catalog, and you can use this for a lot of different reasons. So, for example, whenever there are new collections that are added to Ancestry, they show up in this list. So you will see the most late-breaking databases that have been added. So for example, one of the most recent ones that came to Ancestry from Find My Past was the 1921 England census that also included a separate one for Isle of Man and Wales and the Channel Islands. So you notice all those there. They also have been digitizing a number of records over in Eastern Europe and other places, so all around the world. So it's always good to kind of see what actually is coming up. The card catalog also is a really good place to find something when you're just trying to locate, well, what collection would I use? You could search by the title, of the database or in the keywords. And sometimes I use those kind of interchangeably. If I don't find one in the keywords, I may try the title and vice versa. So, for example, in our research log, we were looking for military service for Henry Poor during the War of 1812. And the collection that was added was the U.S. Army Register of Enlistments, 1798 to 1914. So a very specific collection. So we may want to start off with just like abbreviating that down to a smaller portion. So in this case, if I just search on Army enlistments, I only have one database that shows up. So in that case, that makes it very easy to know I'm finding the right collection. And again, we can hover over that database to see what is it actually included. So it notes anybody that's enlisting in U.S. Army from 1798 to 1914, and then it includes their name, their age and time of enlistment, birthplace, etc. So now we're in a very specific collection that we're going to search. So these are records that were originally held at the National Archives. So I'm going to search on Henry Poor. I am going to add in his birth year, just in case there are multiple Henry Poors, just so I can narrow down I'm not getting someone that was born much later. And by doing this search, I only get two results. Only one that was actually a Henry Poor and one that was a Henry Parr. So again, using that sound X, it sounds close, but the big difference is Henry Poor was born in Massachusetts, Henry Parr was born in Pennsylvania. So, and we don't have a year for Henry Parr, but he is 20, and versus Henry Poor, he's 44. So far, the first result is looking like the most promising. So again, we see Henry Poor, born about 1770 in Massachusetts, 44. Always good, especially with these types of records, to get into the images because there is so much more that's included. So this index record page has a very brief amount of information that you can actually see. So you have to use the image to fill in all the detail. And so by going through the record, we do find Henry Poor. It notes that he was an artificer in the infantry. Under organization, the description, he gives his height. He was 5 feet 4 inches tall. He had gray eyes, gray hair, fair complexion, age 44, occupation, carpenter. Again, consistent there. Born in Newbury, Massachusetts. So that lines up with what we have. It then lists when he enlists in the military at that time. So it would notes about either January 15th or February 15th, 1814. He enlisted in Newburyport, and there was a Mr. Knight that had recruited him. And the period was war. So during the duration of a war, so not necessarily maybe during peacetime. And then the remarks actually gives information on what captains he served under that note that information. And even including to when he was discharged in Plattsburgh, New York, as well. So all really good information. And given the time period of him enlisting in 1814, all the way through to when he was released in 1815, that includes the duration of the War of 1812. So again, we want to make sure we go into our research log and we noted here that he was actually enlisted, that he enlisted in Newburyport and that he was discharged as well and add it to that log. Okay, so now we're going to turn back to our card catalog and now we're going to look for another type of collection. I'm going to then search for city directory. In this case, I find it easier to do a keyword search do it by keyword versus the title. So in this case, if I just type in, u.s.city directory, I get in my top results a collection of U.S. city directories 1822 to 1995. And I was doing a search within this collection now for Henry Poor that would show up in this collection. So I searched for Henry Poor and I decided to search for him, maybe anytime around 1850 or so. And by searching the collection, I had noticed that there was one of the earlier directories was an 1839 record. So I figured that might sound like a good place to start and see what else I could find out about him around this time. Knowing this is after his military service, so he might have already been settled in Boston, and this would have been before that 1840 census that we already found. And so here and now I see there is a Henry Poor who is living at 58 Elliott, and his occupation is a carpenter. And when we get into an image here, we would see who else might have been around him at the time. I may want to look and see, well, what other poors were living near him. I noticed there was a Micaiah poor that was a housewright living at 60 Elliott, so almost right next door. So I might be curious if there's maybe a direct relation with them. So that's why, again, it's really helpful to really look at the images to see, do you spot any potential relatives or other people that look familiar? Because these are largely going to be arranged alphabetically. Here's another really good tip, and this is on Ancestry, and also you see it on our website, American Ancestors. Whenever there's a website that offers you suggested records, it's always good to take a look at them, because I can tell you that how they work is that they basically bring up other records where someone else had searched for that person, and there seemed to be a consistency where that those records kept coming up for those people searching that same name and those dates and years sometimes, that often I can use this and I can find records that I may have missed, but other researchers found. So when you're in a collection like this, Henry Poor, and here's the record page, on the right-hand side, I have these suggested records. And one of the records I see here is there is actually an 1830 census for Henry Poor. So if I didn't go all the way back and went through 1830, I may want to look at that census and see if maybe that's him. So here I do see a Henry Poor. He's living in Boston, Ward 11 in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. He's in the male 50 to 59 years. So I figure, okay, based on the years, it is possible it could be him. And so I may want to add that to my log and note that there was a Henry Poor living in Boston 1830, 1840, and 1850. Now we're going to briefly talk about Find a Grave. So Find a Grave was created as a volunteer website. It has added into the Ancestry umbrella in terms of who actually oversees uh, um, basically software updates that are made to that site or managing, from a moderation standpoint. But it's a great site to look for finding someone that may have had some type of grave. And ideally, the whole point of the site is you're finding where someone actually is buried. And there may or may not be a marker there, but sometimes there usually is something, if not maybe a confirmation from a cemetery that they've buried someone there. But keeping in mind that not everybody in the world is going to have their own memorial page. Not every ancestor will have one. And even if they do, there may not be a photographic proof of the grave. And so I'm very careful with, like, especially when you're looking at really earlier ancestors, is if you don't have a photograph of a grave, you need to look at other pieces of evidence to prove they were buried there, such as cemetery sextant records when they buried someone there. There may be something in a newspaper that noted someone was buried there. There could be something in maybe even their probate file of where they were going to be buried, or even land deeds. So you may need to consult another piece of evidence to confirm if they actually are buried there, to make sure that you found their final resting place if that's what you're trying to identify. Now, oftentimes you can contact some of these cemeteries, and when funeral homes started coming up, see if they have additional details on who you might be missing to make sure you're locating the correct grave. So, our last question we're going to look at here is finding out if a gravestone of Henry Poor exists. So on the Find a Grave site, you have this advanced search option. You can search on their names, their year they're born, year died, where the cemetery is located. You could get down into like countries and even down to counties and states specifically as well. You can search on things in their bio. people will create bi different bios on individuals based on newspaper articles or other history or things that they've come across. So sometimes you might find something unique in the bio that could be searched. You could search on different relationships such as spouse, parent, child, or sibling, um, plot numbers, etc. You could even see if they're looking for a famous person, if you're looking for that, if they were including, maiden name showing up, for example, if you're searching on someone's maiden name for a woman, for example, if there are photos, if there's not photos. So there's lots of options that have been added over the years. So since we have a lot of information on Henry Poor, we're going to search for Henry Poor, and we know he died in 1853 in Massachusetts. So we actually are going to make sure that we put exact for year died and cemetery location in Massachusetts. In this case, we actually get lucky in that there's only one record. There is a Henry Poor who has the same year of birth, June 20th, 1769, and date of death, April 28th, 1853. He is buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there seems to be some type of photograph attached to it. So we want to click on that link for Henry Poor to see the actual memorial page. And so we see actually my colleague David actually added for his ancestors some different photographs here, including even noting the plot number. He had even noted in the bio he was a veteran of the War of 1812. So again, another place of where if you did a search for War of 1812 attached to someone's profile, you could actually pull that up in a search. And you can even link family members. So if you know you have family members buried in other cemeteries, there actually are ways to link them together, which is kind of like a family tree within the site, which I really like. So David actually has his parents linked, both of his spouses linked, Martha and Abigail, their children, his siblings. So all these people are linked together so you can quickly go to another site as needed. And here we do actually see the gravestone photos that have been photographed by him. And so I updated the log and noted here that he was buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery and that there was gravestone photos included. So before we get to our last Q&A, we're just going to give you some quick tips on how to research in offline repositories. So you may have seen that image that David showed in the last class about that, that a lot of things are going to be at the tip of the iceberg for like looking at everything. Think of that for your research as well. Not everything is going to be online, and there's going to be a lot of cases where you're going to have to go somewhere off-site, whether it's your local public library, a historical society, an archives, and they could be near or far to get to. But first you want to do is you want to look at the catalog that these sites have. A lot of them are going to have ones that are available online, which can be searched. Some of them have old index cards that they've basically made into an online database. Some of them have gotten a lot more fancier than others. But it's always good to find out, do they have their own catalog which can be searched? And ideally, if it's from home, that's great. But there might be some cases where you actually have to contact them or go in person to see what they have. You then want to also review any procedures on how you request on-site access if you're planning on traveling to a repository, or in some cases, it might even be cheaper and easier to just ask, can you just have a record photocopied by a member of the staff? Or is there a research fee? So you may want to evaluate, is the cost of going somewhere too high and too great than doing it remotely? I'm a very frugal genealogist, and so there's a lot of cases where I will try to do as much as possible without actually having to go somewhere very far away, unless I really plan on making it a very big trip. So if you wanted to look at a library catalog for a repository, we're going to use the example of our website from American Ancestors for our library in Boston. So when you're on the search screen, you're going to go to Library Catalog. And in here, you're going to get to the different tabs available. So I generally start with things on the keyword tab, but you can also search by the name of title of a specific book or manuscript you're looking for, the author, a subject search, call number, etc. So let's say I wanted to look at, well, what other resources could exist on the poor family? So I'm going to then add in poor family into quotation marks just to narrow it down. Because otherwise I might be getting books on people that are disadvantaged economically versus actually related to the poor family. And the poor family in this case, you could actually do the same kind of search also in a subject search as well, without the quotation marks. So here I get about 21 results. So I have a variety of different things. Most of them are going to be books that we have available. There could be different, books that have been done in different families, Bible records. I really was intrigued by this poor family gathering by the Poor Family Association. So those are all kind of good things to look for, is things that might be specific to the locations where they might have lived and they might have deposited. And there might be very um, there might not be a lot of books that are published and available at other libraries too. So let's say I clicked into that one for the Family Association. It tells me what floor it's on in the library. It tells me it's in the 7th floor stacks. It gives the call number. It's showing that it's available and it's not off-site, because sometimes people are going to put things off-site because we don't have the room for them and they're not actively being used. It tells me what's going to be involved in this and that it's one volume. And sometimes you might get a variety of pagination that's there. If it was a reprint, when it was published. Here it's noting here that there were several reunions that were taking place and where and when. So maybe there could be information on people going to different reunions, and maybe there's photographs or other pieces of information that were put together I might be interested in. A lot of different repositories, including libraries, have what's called special collections. So these are items that are not going to be generally in the regular stacks. They're going to be items you're going to have to request from the archivist. So they could be one-of-a-kind manuscripts, things that were not published, that were maybe deposited, that were the notes of someone, or different collections that were coming from different agencies and archives. It could be a rare book that we obviously just want to make sure we don't lose or have stolen, for example. And there are just other items that just might need a little bit more loving care that we need to put them in special collections. Now, most archives are going to have their own rules, including different operating hours to access them. As I mentioned, there could be things off-site due to space, so you might need to find out how long in advance you need to retrieve them for an on-site visit. Sometimes you might need to give them a week or 2 weeks. So always good to kind of understand upfront what are the limitations. And for American Ancestors members, since our library has just reopened, you actually need to be a paid member of American Ancestors if you want to access something in our special collections, the R. Stanton Avery special collections, for example. So those are the kind of rules you want to pay attention to, because sometimes there might be fees involved to actually access that. And a tip I really have though too is when you're looking for different manuscript collections especially, always ask the archivist and staff if they have a finding aid. If you find there's a really big collection, especially, and you don't know where to start, ask them if they have a finding aid, because that finding aid will actually list the contents down to like the box or the folder number and what is actually included in there. And that can help you, because then you may not need to call back a collection that's like 30 boxes deep. You may only need one folder. So it's good to kind of ask them for these finding aids, and a lot of them may be digitized or can be emailed to you ahead of time so that you know exactly what you're asking for. And this is going to help you save some money and time. On our website on American Ancestors, we actually have a section on how to obtain digital access. There are some example, there are certain digital collections that we have available through our library that we've made. We also talk about the procedures on physical collections and what forms might be filled out. And there is even a section for how to get finding aids for our manuscripts. So these are the kind of things you want to look for on the sites. So always good to make sure you know the rules of what you can and cannot bring. Some repositories are more flexible than others. Some of them allow you to bring in like your full binder of genealogy, your computer, your phone, everything. And some are basically like you pretty much cannot bring anything in at all, including like cell phone, like especially active courthouses. A lot of them will not let you bring your cell phone in, and some of them will tell you to go put it in your car or not bring it with you. And that is just due to the privacy of court cases that are going on. So you really want to understand what you can bring in and what you can't. However, if they do allow you to bring in especially electronics, always good to make sure you have all of those charging cables. I can't tell you how many times we've been on the reference desk and someone has asked us for a cell phone charger. We don't have them. And a lot of repositories will not have extras for you to do it. Like they'll have the outlets, but they won't have the charging cables. So always good to make sure you bring all assorted cables so that you can use them. And also it's always good to have a flash drive. A lot of different repositories allow you to save things from their computers or copiers onto a flash drive. That will then save you on copy costs or having to bring cash with you, etc. And of course, as we've shown during this, always keep your research log updated because even just like with your online searches, especially when you're offline, you want to keep track of what you've already consulted so you don't have to go back to that repository and recheck what you've already done. So it's always good to keep very detailed results of what you've already found or didn't find in those records. So in review, I hope that this course has this part of the course has shown you though that when you're doing an online search, use the principle of less is more. You can always add in more information into your search screen to narrow down what you were trying to find for an online search. Do targeted database searches to maximize those results versus searching all collections because you are narrowing in on something that you know is going to be most likely applicable versus trying to make it fit for everything that's in a system where you might be filtering through a lot of noise and things that are not going to be applicable. Make sure you're always recording all your findings in your research log, both positive and negative, and go offline and look for other repositories that have the collections that you don't need and try to search out those finding aids and other resources. A lot of your archivists are your friend, and they will be very thankful that there are people using those archives and asking the questions up front. So, always good to take a look and see what you can find offline as well to supplement your research. Thank you, and let's turn to our last round of questions.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Melanie. So first, as promised, we have two questions that came in earlier that I said I would save for the final question session. So first up, somebody had asked, what is the best way to find a maiden name for a woman born in the 1700s, especially if multiple marriages are suspected? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. So I think what you have to do is really first, I would say make a timeline of all events of where you know where they were. So if you have her for with a spouse, so assuming she's married, at some point, especially with multiple marriages, you need to kind of make that timeline of when they might have started to marry, have children. You want to seek out those vital records. Those vital records are going to give her name. Sometimes they give marital status, such as if she was a widower. That helps especially with the later marriages. And with the children, that also narrows down locations as well if you haven't found a marriage record. So I would try that. And then I would say is start to maybe look at other people by that name in that community to narrow down possible families. You may need to use the fan approach, looking at the extended family, associates, and neighbors of the spouse of who she married to see who they're interacting with, because that may identify families you need to search. And then you might need to look at things like probate records to identify if she is named in her father's will, for example, with one of those married names. So there might be multiple records you're going to have to consult and definitely exhaust children's records of a couple because often you might find that there might be a maiden name identified, like in a later death record, for example. So, just a few things I would recommend trying.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then the other question was somebody says, I've looked at some records in Ireland from the 1800s, birth, etc., but the lettering slash handwriting is very difficult. Is there a resource for understanding how letters were formed? Any thoughts on that, Melanie?
So, it depends on which records you're consulting. So, I would assume she's searching 1800s. You're probably looking at church records. I would say, depending on the different sites of where they might have been digitizing those records, I use sites like, for example, like Roots Ireland. It's a subscription site, but the people that are doing the transcriptions are reading it from a lot of times the original records and the original, and not relying on the microfilm copy. That can be helpful to know if someone had a better luck reading some of those names, to do that. And sometimes I actually will use some of the AI tools out there. There are a number of tools that you can use even for English handwriting or in Latin, for example, to just get you a better read of what the characters were trying to be. So I use sites like Transcribus, for example, and you can even, if you have something that's, printed, you can even do that in Google Translate. But if it's, since you're looking at largely, handwriting, I would say Transcribus would be a good tool to use.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Melanie. So it's looking like that will wrap up questions tonight. Thank you again for a great lecture this evening. If any of you out there do think of questions later on, do feel free to write to us at education@nhgs.org, or you can also write to Melanie directly. You'll find her email address on the handout for tonight, as well as on the course page. If you are interested in having us do research on your behalf, you can contact us at research@nhgs.org. And if you have more general reference questions about any area of your family history, we've been mentioning our great free chat service. You can chat with our genealogists for free Monday through Saturday from 9 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can access that free service at americanancestors.org/chat. And again, it's totally free and open to the public. You can also book a one-on-one consultation with one of our experts at the link shown on the screen or through the QR code displayed there as well. I'll also mention that Melanie is one of our genealogists who gives a lot of these consultations, so you can book one with her if you'd like. You'll find a recording of tonight's class as well as the handout and the slides at the course webpage shown on your screen. This URL has been shared with you by email, and you can also find it under the My Account section of our website under digital content. And you will have access to all of these materials for the foreseeable future. Thank you again for joining us for this fourth class of our 5-session online seminar. Be sure to join us again next week at the same time when our senior genealogist, Rhonda R. McClure, will discuss analysis for the final class. To join that class session, just go to the course page and click the same link there that you've been using all along for these classes. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org. I look forward to seeing you all online again next week, and goodbye for now.